Long before the Wright brothers took to the skies, the ancient Babylonians were already dreaming of flight, but their myths carried a chilling warning. Picture this: Etana, a mighty king clinging to the back of a soaring eagle, ascending higher and higher toward the heavens. The wind whips past him, the earth shrinks below, and for a moment he feels the exhilaration of defying gravity itself. But then the eagle falters, the grip loosens, and Etana plummets back to the ground, his dream of flight ending in tragedy. This wasn't just a story, it was a stark message carved into the heart of Babylonian culture. Humans were not meant to fly. Why would a civilization so advanced in astronomy, mathematics, and architecture, a people who built towering ziggurats that scraped the sky, tell such terrifying tales about the dangers of flight? To understand, we have to step into their world. Imagine standing at the foot of a ziggurat, its massive steps leading upward as if inviting you to climb toward the gods. These structures weren't just buildings, they were bridges between earth and heaven, symbols of humanity's longing to reach beyond our limits. Yet the myths whispered a sobering truth: some boundaries were never meant to be crossed. The gods guarded their domain fiercely, and those who dared to challenge them, like Etana, paid the ultimate price. What did the Babylonians know that we've forgotten? Their stories weren't just fantastical warnings, they were reflections of a deeper worldview, one that saw the sky as sacred, untouchable, and filled with divine power. Flight wasn't just a physical impossibility, it was a rebellion against the natural order. And as we unravel these ancient tales, we'll discover how they reveal something profound about human ambition, the fear of the unknown, and the timeless tension between aspiration and humility. So let's journey back to the cradle of civilization, where myths weren't just stories, they were lessons etched into the stars. To the Babylonians, the universe wasn't just vast, it was meticulously ordered, with every layer governed by unbreakable laws. The heavens weren't merely a physical space, they were a throne room reserved for gods who demanded absolute reverence. Think of it like an ancient cosmic blueprint. The world was split into 3 tiers, each with its own rulers and unspoken rules. At the bottom lay the underworld, a shadowy realm where the dead resided, cut off from the living. Above that stretched the earthly plane, where humans toiled under the watchful eyes of the gods. And then there was the sky, a shimmering, untouchable realm where deities like Anu, king of the gods, held court amidst the stars. This wasn't just geography. It was a divine hierarchy, a system where stepping out of your assigned place meant inviting chaos. Consider the ziggurats again, those towering staircases to the heavens. They weren't just symbols of ambition, they were careful negotiations with the divine. The Babylonians built upward, but never too far. Even their tallest structures stopped short of the sky, as if to say, "We honor you, but we know our limits." This wasn't humility born of weakness, it was wisdom. Their myths hammered home the consequences of overreach. Take the story of Adapa, a mortal so wise the gods offered him the food of immortality. But when he refused, fearing a trick, he sealed humanity's fate, forever earthbound, forever mortal. The message was clear: the gifts of the gods came with strings attached, and crossing into their realm uninvited was a deadly gamble. What's fascinating is how this cosmic order mirrored their society. Just as the heavens had Anu at the top, Babylon had its king, a mediator between gods and people, but never a god himself. The boundaries weren't just spiritual, they were social, political, even architectural. The sky wasn't empty space waiting to be conquered. It was a living, breathing domain charged with divine energy. To violate that space wasn't just dangerous, it was sacrilege. And so, when their myths forbade flight, it wasn't just about the physical act. It was about preserving a delicate balance, a world where mortals and gods each had their role, and stepping out of line risked everything. This world, you might seem foreign to us today, in an age where planes crisscross the clouds and rockets pierce the stratosphere. But the Babylonians understood something we often forget. Not every boundary exists to be broken. Some lines guard sacred truths, reminding us that ambition, unchecked by respect, can become its own downfall. Their stories weren't just warnings, they were maps of a universe where humility and hubris decided destinies. And as we'll see, that lesson echoes far beyond the ancient sands of Mesopotamia. The story of King Etana reads like an ancient thriller, a pulse-pounding drama etched into clay tablets thousands of years ago. Here was a ruler desperate for an heir, told by the gods that the secret to his lineage lay high above the earth. An eagle, once wounded and rescued by Etana, offers him a deal: climb onto its back, and together they'll ascend to the heavens where the tablet of destinies rests, a divine ledger holding the answers to all things. You can almost feel Etana's heartbeat quicken as the ground falls away, the wind roaring in his ears as they climb past clouds, past stars, toward the realm where mortals were never meant to tread. But then the betrayal. The eagle, perhaps sensing Etana's mounting terror, suddenly spirals out of control. Maybe it was divine sabotage, or maybe the sheer weight of human ambition proved too much for even this celestial steed. The myth doesn't just describe a fall, it paints a visceral nightmare. Etana's fingers slip from the eagle's feathers, his body twisting through empty air as the earth rushes up to meet him. That fatal plunge wasn't just bad luck, it was the universe enforcing its rules. What makes this myth so haunting is what the Tablet of Destinies represented. To the Babylonians, this wasn't just a magical artifact, it was the ultimate cheat code, a repository of knowledge so potent that even the gods guarded it jealously. Etana wasn't just seeking an heir, he was after the blueprint of creation itself, the kind of forbidden insight that blurs the line between mortal and divine. And that's why his story ends in freefall. The eagle's betrayal mirrors a deeper truth. Some doors aren't meant to be opened, some heights aren't meant to be scaled. Compare this to other ancient myths: Icarus flying too close to the sun, the Tower of Babel's collapse, and a pattern emerges. These aren't just stories about failed flight, they're about the peril of reaching for what the gods have reserved for themselves. Etana's plunge wasn't just a punishment, it was a reminder. The sky wasn't empty real estate, it was a courtroom, a throne room, a vault, and mortals who tried to pick the lock. They became object lessons, whispered warnings in the dark, yet there's something bittersweet here too. Etana's desperation for an heir wasn't greed, it was profoundly human. The same drive that pushed him skyward is what pushes scientists today to decode DNA or astronauts to breach the atmosphere. The Babylonians understood this tension better than most. Their myths didn't just say, "Don't fly," they asked, "What are you willing to risk for the answers?" Etana's story lingers because it's not just about limits, it's about the cost of ignoring them. And that's a question as old as the stars themselves. Adapa's story is a haunting counterpoint to Etana's. Where the king fell from the sky, the sage stumbled at the threshold of divinity itself. Imagine a man so brilliant that the gods themselves relied on his wisdom. Adapa wasn't just a mortal, he was a priest, a craftsman of sacred rites, entrusted with the secrets of heaven and earth. But when the south wind capsized his fishing boat one day, his temper flared. With a curse, he shattered the wind's wings, freezing the skies into silence. The gods summoned him to answer for this crime, and here's where the tale twists. Anu, the sky god, offers Adapa not punishment, but the bread and water of eternal life. It's a test, a trap dressed as mercy, and Adapa, warned by his patron god to refuse the gifts, obeys only to realize too late that he'd been tricked into rejecting immortality itself. This wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was a cosmic lesson etched in grief. Where Etana reached too far, Adapa didn't reach far enough. His story mirrors the same delicate dance with divine boundaries, but with a cruel irony. His caution became his curse. The gods didn't punish him for ambition, they punished him for lacking it at the critical moment. Think about that. The Babylonians saw overreach as deadly, but underreach as equally tragic. It wasn't just about flying too high or staying too low, it was about misreading the gods' intentions entirely. What makes Adapa's myth so piercing is how it refracts the same themes as Etana's through a different prism. Both men stood at the precipice of transformation, both faced choices that would define humanity's limits. Etana's eagle failed him, Adapa's own wisdom failed him. And in both cases, the message was clear. The gods guarded their gifts jealously, whether those gifts were knowledge or ascension. The sky wasn't just physically off limits, it was psychologically treacherous, a realm where every offer could be a trick, every invitation a snare. Yet there's a profound duality here. Adapa's failure wasn't just a warning, it was an explanation. His story answered a question that must have haunted the Babylonians: why do we die? Why are we bound to the earth? The myth doesn't just say the gods decided it. It shows a moment where humanity almost grasped eternity and then fumbled it. That's why these tales resonated so deeply. They weren't arbitrary rules, they were origin stories for human limitation. Place Adapa beside Etana, and you see the full spectrum of Babylonian anxiety about the heavens. One man flew too boldly, the other hesitated too long. Together, their stories framed the sky as a place of impossible choices where every step toward divinity risked either wrath or regret. For a civilization that mapped the stars with such precision, that built towers scraping the clouds, these myths were more than folklore. They were a way to confess the quiet terror of aspiration, that the closer you get to the gods, the more perilous the path becomes. And isn't that a fear we still whisper today, even with steel wings and fire-breathing engines? The Babylonians just had the courage to name it. The Ziggurats of Babylon weren't just architectural marvels, they were monuments to a paradox. Take the Etana, the legendary tower that may have inspired the biblical Tower of Babel. Rising in 7 terraced tiers toward the heavens, its glazed bricks catching the sunlight like a beacon, it was designed to awe. But here's the thing, for all their grandeur, these structures had a silent rule written into their very steps. Common people could ascend only so far before hitting an invisible barrier. The higher levels reserved for priests, the summit forbidden to all but the gods. It was the ultimate tease, a stairway to heaven with a locked gate at the top. This wasn't arbitrary hierarchy, it was cosmic theater. Every ziggurat mirrored the Babylonian vision of the universe, layered, ordered, and governed by strict boundaries. The 7 tiers corresponded to the 7 known celestial spheres, each level symbolizing a step closer to divine presence. But unlike our modern skyscrapers, which celebrate human conquest of height, ziggurats whispered a warning in their geometry. The higher you climbed, the thinner the air became, not just physically but spiritually. To breach the upper tiers wasn't just trespassing, it was an assault on the fabric of creation itself. Consider the ritual processions winding up those stepped slopes during festivals. Priests carried statues of gods through the temple gates, reenacting a celestial commute between realms. The message was unmistakable. Movement between worlds wasn't forbidden, it was strictly regulated, a divine commute only the gods could authorize. Even the ziggurat's name, Etana, spelled it out, the foundation of heaven and earth. Not the union, not the blending, the foundation, a line drawn in sacred stone. What's fascinating is how this architectural restraint contrasts with the civilization's brilliance. These were the people who mapped Venus's cycles, invented the sextant, and calculated eclipses with eerie precision. They could have built higher, dreamed bolder. But they chose restraint, embedding their myths into mortar. The ziggurat wasn't a challenge to the gods, it was a conversation, a way to say, "We see your domain, we honor its majesty, and we know our place." That's why the Etemenanki's ruins still whisper to us across millennia. In an age where we race to colonize Mars and privatize spaceflight, their towers stand as ghostly reminders. Some frontiers aren't just technical hurdles to overcome. They're philosophical ones. The Babylonians understood that reaching upward shouldn't mean reaching beyond, that aspiration needs anchors in humility. Their Ziggurats didn't fail because they couldn't touch the sky. They succeeded because they taught humans how to look up without forgetting where they stood. If Etana's fall was a cautionary tale about reaching too high, and Adapa's refusal a warning about hesitating too long, then the gods who orchestrated these trials were the ultimate gatekeepers of cosmic privilege, none more so than Enlil and E. These weren't just deities, they were celestial bureaucrats enforcing an invisible hierarchy with ruthless precision. Enlil, the storm god whose breath could level cities, embodied the fury of the heavens against mortal trespass. E, the god of wisdom, played a subtler game, dispensing knowledge like a miser doling out coins, always withholding just enough to keep humanity in its place. Together, they formed a divine tag team, one wielding thunderbolts, the other weaving riddles, both ensuring the sky remained a members-only realm. Take the myth of the Me, the sacred decrees governing everything from kingship to basket weaving. These weren't just rules, they were the source code of creation, and Enlil guarded them like trade secrets. When the god Enki's counterpart in some traditions once leaked divine knowledge to humans, it sparked chaos, floods, plagues, the whole celestial security system crashing down. The message was unmistakable. Knowledge wasn't just power, it was property, and theft carried cosmic consequences. This wasn't petty jealousy, it was a maintenance contract for the universe. Let humans peek behind the curtain, and the whole show might collapse. Marduk's rise to supremacy adds another layer to this celestial classism. As Babylon's patron god, he didn't just rule the sky, he patented it. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic, shows him crafting the world from the corpse of the chaos dragon Tiamat, then appointing stars as divine watchmen to police the boundaries between realms. His ultimate power move, installing the Tablet of Destinies, that same artifact Etana died trying to reach as a celestial firewall, encrypting divine authority where no mortal could crack it. The symbolism here is bone-chilling. Order itself depended on keeping humanity locked out, yet there's a twisted generosity in how these gods toyed with their human subjects. He warned Adapa to refuse immortality, yes, but he also gifted humanity with civilization's tools, agriculture, law, medicine. It's as if the gods were saying, here's enough rope to build a society, but never enough to hang us with. This tension between patronage and paranoia reveals the heart of Babylonian theology. The gods needed humans to feed them with sacrifices to maintain their temples, but they also feared them. Every ziggurat, every hymn, every star chart was a diplomatic negotiation with beings who could annihilate them on a whim. What's startling is how these ancient fears mirror modern debates over AI or genetic engineering, who gets to play God. The Babylonians framed it first: knowledge isn't neutral, it comes with thresholds, with licenses, with divine NDAs. When their myth showed gods smiting curious humans, they weren't just spinning campfire tales, they were wrestling with the ethics of ambition itself. The sky wasn't empty space, it was a vault of intellectual property, and the penalty for hacking it wasn't just death, it was becoming a cautionary tale whispered for millennia. The eagle in Babylonian myth wasn't just a creature, it was a paradox with wings. On one hand, it soared as the ultimate divine messenger, a bridge between earth and heaven, trusted to carry prayers skyward and omens downward. Its razor-sharp vision mirrored the gods' all-seeing gaze, and its mastery of the skies made it the natural ally of deities who ruled from above. But that same proximity to the divine gave the eagle a darker role: enforcer. When Etana clung to its back, he wasn't just hitching a ride, he was placing his fate in the claws of a being whose loyalty ultimately lay with the gods, not with him. Think of how Mesopotamian art depicted eagles, talons outstretched, often gripping lions or serpents, symbols of chaos subdued. This wasn't just decoration, it was propaganda. The eagle represented order imposed from above, a feathered warrant officer for the god's will. Yet in Etana's story, that order twisted into something sinister. The eagle's betrayal wasn't random. It was a calculated demonstration that even the most trusted intermediaries could become instruments of divine punishment. One moment the bird lifts Etana toward salvation, the next it becomes the architect of his downfall. The message, divine favors are loans, not gifts, and the gods always collect. What makes this duality so chilling is how it reflects the Babylonian view of the natural world. Animals weren't just beasts, they were extensions of divine authority woven into the cosmic hierarchy. The eagle's flight wasn't mere biology, it was a performance of sacred geometry, tracing the boundary between permitted and forbidden. When it abandoned Etana mid-air, it wasn't acting on animal instinct. It was executing a celestial verdict, reminding humans that even the creatures they thought they'd tamed answered to a higher power. Compare this to other ancient symbols, the Greek eagle of Zeus, a steady companion, or the Christian dove of peace. Babylonian mythology refused such comforting simplicity. Their eagle was both lifeline and executioner, a lesson carved in feathers and freefall. It taught that the gods' messengers could pivot from guides to grim reapers in a wingbeat. That trust placed in the divine came with invisible fine print. For a civilization that read the stars like a newspaper, the eagle's fickleness wasn't a flaw, it was the whole point. The sky wasn't a democracy. Its rulers kept their secrets, their weapons, and their right to change the rules mid-flight. Across civilizations and epochs, the act of flying never remained just about wings and air. It became a language, a defiant syntax written against the heavens. The Babylonians weren't alone in framing flight as rebellion. Their myths echo in the shudder of Icarus's wax wings melting under Apollo's glare, in the cacophony of languages scattering from Babel's unfinished spire. These stories share more than tragedy, they're united by a primal understanding. To fly was to fracture the oldest chains, the ones binding mortals to the dirt beneath their feet. Take Icarus, that boy who danced too close to the sun. His father Daedalus crafted those wings as tools of escape, but in the sun's hands they became declarations of war, not against Crete's labyrinth, but against gravity itself. The Greeks, like the Babylonians, saw the sky as a gilded cage, its bars invisible but unyielding. When Icarus ignored his father's warnings, his plunge wasn't just a failure of engineering, it was a verdict. The gods permitted cleverness, even admired it, but ambition, untempered by reverence, snapped its own wings. Then there's Babel, that towering finger jabbed at the clouds. The biblical account paints it as a sin of unity. Nothing will be impossible for them. Yahweh frets, but peel back the layers, and it mirrors Babylon's own terror of unchecked ascent. The Ziggurats showed restraint. Babel's builders discarded it. Their crime wasn't height, it was hunger. They sought not just to reach heaven, but to dissolve the line between human and divine, to storm the boardroom of creation itself. The gods' response, scattering their language, wasn't mere punishment. It was a forced humility, a reminder that some walls aren't meant to be scaled. Even the Hindu epic Ramayana whispers this theme. When the demon king Ravana flies his chariot across the skies, his power seems limitless until Rama's arrow, guided by cosmic law, shears through his hubris mid-flight. Ravana's fall isn't just defeat, it's cosmology in action. The universe, these stories insist, has a filing system. Mortals here, gods there, and woe to those who misshelve themselves. What's striking is how these myths, separated by continents and centuries, converge on the same truth. Flight symbolized more than physical elevation. It was alchemy, transforming base human clay into something rivaling the divine. And the gods, jealous of their prerogatives, policed this alchemy ruthlessly. The Greeks had Prometheus, chained for stealing fire. The Norse had Loki, bound for unraveling fate. Flight joined fire and immortality as a third rail of transgression. Touch it, and the cosmos would recoil, yet buried in these warnings is a perverse tribute. Why guard a boundary unless what lies beyond is potent? These myths concede reluctantly that flight wasn't just possible, it was plausible enough to require divine countermeasures. The Babylonians, with their star charts and ziggurats, came closer than most to bridging the gap. Their eagles weren't just symbols, they were taunts, feathered proofs that the sky wasn't empty, just exclusive. And that's the real sting. The heavens weren't forbidden because humans couldn't reach them. They were forbidden because, given the chance, humans just might. The Babylonians didn't just gaze at the stars, they mapped them with mathematical precision, tracking Venus's cycles centuries before telescopes existed. But this knowledge wasn't for everyone. Hidden within temple archives, tablets like the Venus tablet of Amasajuko weren't scientific records. They were divine blueprints, accessible only to priests who decoded celestial patterns as messages from the gods. Imagine a scribe crouched over wet clay by lamplight, etching the planet's movements not as astronomy, but as whispered conversations between deities. To share these secrets with outsiders wasn't just forbidden, it was an act of cosmic treason. Why such secrecy? Because in Babylon, the sky wasn't a passive canvas of light. Every eclipse, every retrograde motion was a coded dispatch from Marduk or Ishtar, clues to impending floods, wars, or plagues. Priests acted as cryptographers, translating celestial omens into royal advisories. This wasn't just science, it was statecraft with celestial stakes. When the Venus tablet predicted drought, it wasn't a farmer's almanac. It was leverage, proof that the gods favored those who controlled the narrative. No wonder myths like Etana's warned against unauthorized sky-gazing. If civilians could read the stars who needed priests, the parallels between flight myths and astronomical gatekeeping are uncanny. Just as Etana's eagle betrayed him for overreaching, the heavens themselves punished those who pried without permission. A merchant tracking Venus to predict trade winds. Heresy, a scholar calculating lunar cycles without temple approval, dangerous ambition. The gods had rigged the system. Celestial knowledge wasn't enlightenment, it was a leash, and priests held the other end. Even their star catalogues reinforced this hierarchy. Constellations weren't just pictures, they were divine bureaucracies, with each star assigned administrative roles governing human fates. Consider the Enuma Anu Enlil, a massive compendium of omens spanning 70 tablets. Its entries read like hacked divine emails. If Jupiter rises late in the month, the king's son will revolt. This wasn't astronomy for curiosity's sake. It was a proprietary algorithm, its source code guarded like nuclear secrets. The message was clear, the sky was a vault and its combination changed daily. Myths about fatal flights weren't about physics, they were firewalls deterring intellectual trespassers. After all, if humans could decode the heavens without mediation, what stopped them from bypassing the gods entirely? Yet beneath this control lurked a delicious irony. By meticulously recording celestial data, Babylon's priests accidentally built the foundations of modern science. Their divine secrets became Kepler's laws, their eclipse cycles our lunar calendars. The very knowledge they hoarded as sacred would one day democratize the cosmos. But for millennia, their system held. The sky stayed a gated community, its mysteries doled out in carefully measured doses, and the myths, they were the velvet rope warning mortals. Curiosity invited not just failure but divine retribution. The Babylonians understood something we often forget: knowledge isn't neutral. It's power, and power is never given freely. Even today, as satellites whirl overhead, their ancient tension echoes: who gets to own the sky? Etana wasn't just a man falling from the sky, he was a king, a ruler whose very title came stamped with divine approval, and that's what makes his story so subversive. In a world where monarchs claimed their crowns were gifts from the gods, Etana's plunge was a visceral reminder: even the mightiest human authority had ceilings. The Babylonians didn't just fear flight, they feared what it represented: the illusion that power, once granted, could be stretched beyond its divine leash. Take the famous Code of Hammurabi, etched into stone centuries after Etana's myth took root. At the top of that stele, carved in unshakable basalt, the sun god Shamash hands Hammurabi the scepter of justice. It's a scene replicated across Mesopotamian art, kings kneeling before deities, receiving not just crowns but conditions. The message was unambiguous. Rule wasn't ownership, it was custodianship. A king who forgot that, who reached beyond his mandate like Etana grasping for the tablet of destinies, risked more than his life, he risked his legacy. Historical records whisper of real-world echoes. When the Assyrian king Sargon II built his palace at Dur-Sharukin, he filled its walls with reliefs of gennies, winged deities holding buckets of purifying water. These weren't decorations, they were visual contracts. Every time Sargon walked those halls, he passed under their gaze, a silent audit of his compliance with divine will. Even his name, Sargon, harked back to the legendary Sargon of Akkad, a ruler who claimed the goddess Ishtar, let no other reign but him. But here's the catch, such endorsements came with fine print. The moment a king stopped being a conduit for the gods and started acting like their equal, the myths promised his wings would melt. The Ziggurat rituals drove this home with theater-like precision. During the Akitu festival, the New Year celebration, the king would endure a ritual humiliation stripped of his regalia, slapped across the face by a priest, forced to kneel before Marduk's statue. Only after swearing he hadn't abused his power would the gods reappoint him. Think about that, the most powerful man in Babylon had to annually prove he remembered his place. Etana's fatal flight wasn't just a myth, it was a yearly reenactment of what happened to kings who got too comfortable. This delicate dance between divine favor and mortal ambition bled into politics. When the Babylonian king Nabonidus abandoned Marduk's cult for the moon god Sin, his subjects revolted, calling it not just impious but unconstitutional. The gods had assigned roles, and even kings couldn't rewrite the script. Cyrus the Great understood this when he conquered Babylon in 539 BC. Instead of smashing Marduk's statues, he posed as the god's chosen liberator, his propaganda claiming Marduk had scanned all lands for a just ruler. The lesson: you could conquer empires, but never the hierarchy. What's chilling is how these myths and rituals sculpted a culture of controlled ambition. Kings built ziggurats not to challenge the gods but to flatter them. They waged wars not as personal glory but as divine errands. Even Hammurabi's famous laws weren't his, they were Shamash's, handed down like a celestial employee manual. The moment a ruler confused stewardship with ownership, the myths promised the same fate as Etana, a throne left empty, a name whispered as warning. Power wasn't a ladder to the heavens, it was a leash lovingly gilded but unbreakable. And in that tension between crown and cosmos, the Babylonians found their most enduring political philosophy, that the highest human authority is still, eternally, on a need-to-know basis. For the Babylonians, birds weren't just animals, they were skyborne telegrams from the gods, their every flight path and landing spot scrutinized for hidden meaning. Imagine a haruspex, one of Babylon's elite diviners, crouched on a rooftop at dawn, his eyes tracking a vulture's lazy circles. The bird's altitude, its wing beats, even the direction it turned its head, each detail carried weight. A falcon soaring west might herald military victory, while an eagle perched on a temple gate could signal divine displeasure. But among these aerial omens, one pattern stood out. Whenever a bird's flight mirrored human ambition climbing too boldly, lingering too long near sacred spaces, the interpretation was chillingly consistent. The gods were watching, and they didn't like trespassers. The Shama Immeru, a collection of omens etched into clay tablets, reads like a celestial rulebook. One entry describes a raven flying higher than a city's tallest tower, a sure sign of impending drought or rebellion. Another warns that if a swallow nests in a palace eaves, the king will soon be carried away like the bird itself. These weren't vague prophecies, they were coded legal precedents binding the natural world to human fate. What made flight omens especially potent was their duality. Birds could be messengers or monitors, their wings stitching the seam between heaven and earth. A heron skimming the Euphrates at sunset might bear blessings, but that same heron ascending vertically. That wasn't a bird, that was a boundary test, and failing it meant catastrophe. Haruspices didn't just read omens, they enforced cosmic law. When a winged omen appeared, their job was to determine whether it marked permission or prohibition. Take the Alu demon, a winged terror said to descend on those who angered the gods. Its appearances in omen texts weren't random, they clustered around moments of human hubris, like a ruler expanding his palace beyond ordained limits. The message was surgical: reach too high and the sky itself would send enforcers. This wasn't superstition, it was social control wrapped in feathers. By making the heavens a surveillance system, the elite ensured that even private ambitions became matters of divine jurisdiction. Perhaps the most revealing omen involves the Anzu, a mythical lion-headed eagle. According to the Epic of Anzu, this creature didn't just fly, it stole the tablet of destinies from Enlil, briefly upending the cosmic order before being slain. The allegory here is razor-sharp. Flight equaled theft, a brazen heist of divine authority. No wonder Babylon's haruspices treated unusual bird flights like security breaches. When an Anzu appeared in omens, it wasn't just a bad sign. It was a drill training observers to spot and suppress any hint of Etana's ambition in the populace. What's striking is how these interpretations seeped into everyday life. Farmers scanning for migrating storks weren't just checking crop signs, they were auditing their own compliance with celestial zoning laws. Merchants noting a hawk's dive over the marketplace weren't merely predicting prices, they were gauging whether their latest venture might attract divine overhead inspections. Even children learned early, point too enthusiastically at a passing flock, and parents would hush them, as if the gods might mistake curiosity for conspiracy. The brilliance of this system lay in its self-reinforcing logic. Birds flew where they pleased, but haruspices controlled the translations, a king's failed campaign. Blame it on a misinterpreted goose migration, a collapsed bridge. Clearly someone missed the warning in that owl's midnight glide. By making the sky a celestial courtroom, with birds as both witnesses and bailiffs, the Babylonians turned meteorology into morality. Flight wasn't forbidden because it was impossible. It was forbidden because the gods had already written the verdict in the wings of every passing bird. And in that tension between wonder and warning, humanity's oldest dream found its most haunting restraint. Could the Babylonians have actually tried to fly? Behind their cautionary myths, there's tantalizing evidence that some daring minds may have tested the boundaries of their celestial laws. Take the ancient kites of Mesopotamia, massive, reed and leather constructions that could lift ceremonial offerings skyward during rituals. These weren't children's toys, they were engineered to hover at the threshold of the forbidden, dangling gifts just close enough to the gods to appease them without breaching their domain. Archaeologists have unearthed clay tablets depicting these airborne contraptions, their designs suspiciously advanced for mere ritual props. The lines between sacred symbol and prototype blur here. What if these kites were more than symbolic? What if they were trial runs, hushed experiments cloaked in religious decorum? Then there's the matter of Babylonian mechanics. The same civilization that calculated square roots and predicted eclipses also left behind intricate gear systems, bronze fragments that suggest an understanding of torque, lift, and resistance. The famous Antikythera mechanism, often hailed as the Greeks' crowning technological marvel, had precursors in Mesopotamia. Temple records speak of animated idols with moving parts, their wings flapping via hidden pulleys during ceremonies. Were these divine puppets or blueprints? When the myth of Etana describes an eagle with wings that never tire, it's hard not to wonder if someone somewhere was sketching designs based on observed physics rather than pure fantasy. Consider the shaduf, a counterweighted irrigation tool common along the Euphrates. Its lever and weight principles mirror the mechanics needed for basic flight stability. Could Babylonian engineers, watching these devices pivot and lift, have theorized scaled-up versions capable of hoisting humans. The mathematics existed. Their astronomy required precise angular calculations, the kind that could also plot glide paths. And let's not forget their material innovations: bitumen-coated reeds for waterproofing, linen stretched over wooden frames, materials light yet sturdy enough to tempt a tinkerer's imagination. But here's the chilling part. Every technological leap in Babylon came with theological oversight. The same priests who recorded Venus's movements also guarded the divine decrees governing innovation. A tablet from Nineveh warns of the man who fashioned wings against the god's will, his fate left ominously blank. Was this a metaphor or a redacted incident? The archaeological record holds whispers: a charred workshop near Ur, filled with half-melted metal fragments resembling primitive hinges, a bas-relief in Sippar showing a figure suspended between two bird-like shapes, too detailed to be purely mythological. These fragments suggest a culture flirting with flight, then recoiling from its implications. The myths of Etana and Adapa weren't just stories. They were legal precedents, intellectual property laws etched into the collective psyche. To fly wasn't just to defy gravity, it was to violate the god's patent on elevation. And in a society where kings derived power from acting as heaven's intermediaries, unauthorized ascension wasn't just dangerous. It was treason. Perhaps that's why the kite stayed ritually small, the gear systems limited to temple wonders. The Babylonians may have glimpsed the physics of flight, but their myths and the priests who enforced them kept those dreams tethered. Every time a kite trembled in the wind, it wasn't just carrying offerings, it was testing the tensile strength of divine permission. And the verdict, written in plummeting kings and shattered wings, was clear: some blueprints belonged to the gods alone. If the eagle was Babylon's celestial enforcer, Pazuzu was the sky's unchecked chaos incarnate, a wind demon whose very breath could peel flesh from bone. Picture this grotesque figure looming over the city: a snarling dog's face, scaly lion paws, wings like a storm front, and a serpent coiled where his tongue should be. Unlike the ordered deities of the Ziggurats, Pazuzu didn't answer to kings or priests. He was the embodiment of the sky's unpredictability, a reminder that between the tidy layers of Babylonian cosmology lurked forces no mortal could control. This wasn't just superstition, it was meteorology wrapped in myth. When the Shamal winds roared down from the north, scouring fields with dust and sending families cowering behind clay walls, Babylonians didn't see weather. They saw Pazuzu's laughter. His presence explained why the heavens resisted human intrusion better than any theological decree. A king might negotiate with Marduk, but how do you bargain with a being whose sole language is hurricanes? The irony is that Pazuzu wasn't purely evil. Amulets bearing his likeness hung in doorways and birthing chambers, his frightful gaze meant to ward off worse demons like Lamashtu, the child killer. Even the gods kept him on retainer, a necessary monster to maintain balance. This duality made him the perfect symbol for Babylon's conflicted relationship with the sky. The same winds that destroyed villages also carried seeds and rain. The atmosphere wasn't just hostile, it was capricious, offering life and death in the same gust. What's chilling is how these storm deities operated outside celestial bureaucracy. While Enlil governed orderly phenomena sunrise, the seasons Pazuzu and his ilk ruled the exceptions. The Babylonian wind demon roster reads like a meteorological hit list. Huwawa, guardian of the cedar forests, whose breath was a whirlwind stripping bark from trees. Mdugud, the thunderbird whose wing beats shook mountains loose from their foundations. Asaku, a plague wind that crept into lungs like poisonous fog. These weren't mere spirits, they were atmospheric booby traps, explaining why humans couldn't colonize the sky even if the gods permitted it. The myths spelled it out: the higher you climbed, the less divine law protected you. At ground level, rituals could appease the gods, but at altitude, you entered the jurisdiction of entities who didn't accept offerings, only sacrifices. Consider the practical implications. Babylonian scholars tracked planetary movements with precision, yet their wind charts were riddled with gaps. They could predict Venus's position years in advance, but a sandstorm. That was Pazuzu's whim. This wasn't ignorance, it was brutal honesty about the limits of human mastery. The sky wasn't just governed, it was infested, and no amount of mathematics could tame its demons. The lesson etched into these myths cuts deeper than divine jealousy. The Babylonians acknowledged something we often ignore. Nature isn't just physics to be conquered. It's a living system with its own moods and mercies. Their wind demons personified the truth that flight isn't merely a technical challenge. It's a negotiation with forces that don't care about human ambition. Even today, as jets slice through turbulence, we still speak of fighting the weather. Pazuzu would grin at that. Some battles, his myths whisper, were never meant to be won. The fear of human flight wasn't unique to Babylon. It was a global cautionary thread woven through the myths of civilizations separated by oceans and centuries. Across the world, cultures whispered the same warning. The sky wasn't just empty space waiting to be conquered. It was a realm with rules guarded by forces far older than written history. Take ancient China, where the brilliant inventor Wan, who strapped 47 gunpowder rockets to a chair in the 15th century, aiming to reach the heavens. Legends say he vanished in a blaze of smoke. Whether as victim or pioneer depends on who tells the tale. But the deeper truth lies in how the Ming dynasty reacted. They banned further experiments, decreeing rocketry strictly for warfare, not ascension. The message was eerily Babylonian. Some knowledge wasn't just dangerous, it was heresy. Venture north to Scandinavia, and the Norse had their own airborne tragedies. The saga of the dwarven brothers Jalla and Gala tells of a winged harness forged to escape the wrath of the gods, only for its wings to melt under Thor's thunderous glare, sending them crashing into the sea. Sound familiar? Like Icarus with a Viking twist, their story underscored a shared belief. Flight wasn't merely a physical feat, it was theft, an attempt to steal the gods' vantage point. Even Odin, with his ravens Hugin and Munin, didn't fly himself. He sent proxies, respecting an unspoken celestial zoning law. Half a world away, the Aztecs wove similar warnings into their cosmology. The god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, could traverse the sky, but when humans tried to follow, their winged contraptions became death traps. The Florentine Codex recounts how an anonymous craftsman built wooden wings during the reign of Moctezuma, only to break his legs upon landing. The Aztec priests declared it a sign. The heavens belonged to Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, who shattered mortal arrogance with divine precision. What's striking is how these stories mirror each other without cultural contact. The Maya had their own version. The Popol Vuh hero twins, who fashioned bird disguises to infiltrate the underworld, only to be exposed when their fake wings molted at the worst moment. In Aboriginal Australian lore, the Wandjina spirits forbade humans from touching the clouds, painting this taboo in ochre on cave walls. Even the Bible's Tower of Babel, though set in Mesopotamia, resonated globally. A structure tall enough to reach heaven provoked not just confusion but divine demolition. Why this universal anxiety? Because flight wasn't just about altitude, it symbolized the ultimate rebellion against natural order. Agricultural societies relied on predictable seasons, on gods who kept the sun and rain in balance. A human in the sky disrupted that delicate negotiation like a chess piece leaping off the board. The myths weren't just fantasies, they were social contracts, reinforcing hierarchies where priests and kings mediated between earth and heaven. Let mortals fly, and who needed temples, who feared kings, but here's the twist, these stories also betray a sneaking admiration. Every culture that forbade flight also dreamed of it obsessively. The Chinese flew kites for military signals, the Norse carved winged helmets for symbolic power, the Aztecs dressed warriors in quetzal feathers to mimic avian grace. The very intensity of the prohibitions hints at how close some ancient innovators came, and how desperately the elites needed to suppress them. These myths fade into history, but their legacy lingers. Every time a modern rocket launch is delayed for safety checks, or a drone is grounded for violating airspace, we're replaying an ancient drama. The sky still has rules. The gods just wear FAA uniforms now. The phrase, "the eagle cast him down from mid-heaven," wasn't just a line in Etana's myth, it was a refrain, a chorus hammered into clay tablets across Mesopotamia with almost ritual precision. These weren't casual descriptions, they were standardized formulas, repeated word for word like legal verdicts or sacred hymns. When a Babylonian scribe etched those words, he wasn't merely recording a story. He was engraving a cosmic precedent, a warning etched into the very syntax of their language. Notice the specificity of the phrasing, not just "he fell," but "from mid-heaven." This wasn't a random detail. In Babylonian cosmology, the sky had layers 3, 7, sometimes even 12 tiers, each with its own rules and guardians. Mid-heaven marked the point of no return, the moment when a climber passed beyond earthly rescue and entered the jurisdiction of the gods. That exact phrase appears in omen texts, royal inscriptions, even medical incantations, always with the same eerie cadence. A broken pot omen from Nineveh warns of a general who will be cast down from mid-heaven like a shooting star. A curse tablet invokes the same fate on traitors. May they plummet as Etana did. The repetition wasn't accidental, it was mnemonic, tattooing the consequences of hubris into collective memory. What's fascinating is how these falling motifs mirror real-world rituals. During the Akitu festival, priests would reenact divine battles by hurling effigies from ziggurat platforms, symbolic falls that literalized the mythic warnings. Even the language of treaties borrowed this imagery. Vassal kings swore loyalty oaths under threat of being thrown from the tower like a clay bird, their bodies shattering like the terracotta tokens smashed in ceremonial curses. The metaphors bled into everyday speech too. A merchant's ledgers might describe bad debts as fallen from the ledger of Marduk, while lovelorn poetry lamented hearts dropped like stones from heaven's balcony. This wasn't just literary flair, it was cognitive programming. By grafting the terror of the fall onto everything from politics to romance, the Babylonians made celestial law visceral. You didn't need to climb an eagle to understand the cost of overreach. The language itself kept you grounded. Compare this to modern phrases like career suicide or social freefall. We still use dissent as shorthand for failure, but the Babylonians weaponized it. Their falling motifs weren't metaphors, they were micro-lessons, each repetition another stitch in the cultural safety net meant to catch ambition before it soared too high. The brilliance of this linguistic engineering lies in its adaptability. Later Assyrian annals tweaked the phrasing when describing defeated enemies. I flung him from his tower like a fledgling, proving how durable the template was. Even in incantations against disease, feverish patients were said to tremble like Etana mid-fall, their sickness framed as divine retribution for intangible trespasses. The fall wasn't just a plot point, it was a diagnostic tool, a way to explain suffering through the lens of broken boundaries. Yet beneath this relentless repetition, there's a whisper of something raw and human. The same tablets that coldly record falls also preserve pleads from scribes to their gods. Do not let my name plummet from your lips. Here, the motif twists into vulnerability, a confession that even those who enforced the rules feared the drop. That duality is what makes these phrases so haunting. They weren't just threats, they were mirrors reflecting a civilization both in awe and terror of the heights they could almost, but never quite, reach. And in that tension between aspiration and syntax, language itself became the last, unbreakable tether. The ziggurat wasn't just a building, it was a stage for the greatest performance in Babylonian life, a carefully choreographed dance between earth and heaven. Every new year during the Akitu festival, priests would ascend its terraced levels in solemn procession, carrying statues of the gods draped in gold and lapis lazuli. With each step, they reenacted the celestial journey Etana had dared to make for real. But here's the twist: this wasn't just pageantry. It was sanctioned flight, a divine loophole that let mortals touch the sky without triggering the gods' wrath. The higher the priests climbed, the thinner the veil between worlds became, until at the summit, in a cloud of incense, they whispered prayers meant to trickle down from the heavens like rain. This was flight by proxy, ambition funneled through ritual. For those who couldn't join the priestly escalade, there were other avenues to the divine. Hidden in temple archives are recipes for kukru, a psychoactive brew made from honey, myrrh, and something scholars still debate. Perhaps opium, maybe mandrake. When swallowed during moon ceremonies, it reportedly gave devotees visions of soaring over mountains and rivers, their souls temporarily loaned wings. The descriptions etched onto clay tablets are eerily consistent. A tingling in the limbs, the ground falling away, and then suddenly, the world seen from above like a map unfurled. These weren't mere hallucinations to the Babylonians. They were controlled glimpses beyond the mortal plane, supervised by temple authorities who knew exactly how high was too high. Even children participated in this celestial negotiation. School tablets from Nippur describe a ritual where boys fashioned tiny clay eagles, tying them to strings and launching them from rooftops while reciting lines from Etana's myth. The moment the figurine began to dive, a priest would snatch the string, yanking it back to earth, a visceral lesson in boundaries masked as play. Meanwhile, temple weavers created elaborate bird costumes for oracle dancers, whose flapping, spiraling motions were believed to channel messages from winged intermediaries like the Anzu. Every flap of those fabric wings was a transaction. The gods got ceremony, humans got catharsis, and the sky remained technically inviolate. The most ingenious substitute, though, lay in their astronomy. By tracking planets across the night sky, Babylonian scholars didn't just predict harvests, they rode the orbits mentally, their calculations serving as cerebral flight paths. A tablet from Yorok contains star charts annotated with phrases like "Marduk's chariot passes here," implying that to map the heavens was to hitch a ride on divine vehicles. This was flight by numbers, elevation achieved through equations instead of eagles. What's striking is how these rituals preserved the thrill of ascent while neutering its danger. The priests climbing the ziggurat got the view without the fall. The kukru-drunk visionary experienced weightlessness without betrayal. Even the child's clay eagle offered the illusion of control, right up until the priest's hand intervened. The Babylonians understood something profound about human nature. We don't just crave flight, we crave the safety net. Their genius was in building one sturdy enough to satisfy both mortals and gods. In the grand tapestry of Babylonian flight myths, one absence screams louder than any plummeting king or falling hero. Where were the women? The stories of Etana, Adapa, and the eagle are undeniably male. Tales of kings, sages, and gods whose struggles with the heavens revolve around power, legacy, and divine favor. But scan the clay tablets for female figures attempting flight, and you'll find dust. This wasn't accidental. Mesopotamian society meticulously policed gender roles, and the sky was no exception. Women weren't just absent from these myths, their exclusion was baked into the cosmology itself. Consider the rigid hierarchy of Babylonian life. While men could ascend to priesthood or kingship roles that granted symbolic access to the divine, women's domains were earthbound: home, hearth, and the weaving loom. Even the language of flight reinforced this divide. Omen texts describe men soaring like eagles in battle, while women's movements were likened to fluttering sparrows or grounded doves. The few female deities who did traverse the heavens, like the war goddess Ishtar, were exceptions that proved the rule. When Ishtar descended to the underworld in the epic of her namesake, her journey wasn't flight but a forced march. stripped of her regalia at each gate until she stood naked before Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. Compare that to Etana's eagle-assisted ascent. One was a fall from grace, the other a reach for glory. The practical implications were stark. While men could theoretically, if fatally challenge celestial boundaries, women's access to the sky was mediated through strict filters. Temple records from Sippar reveal that women could serve as Nadatu priestesses, but their rituals focused on fertility and earth magic, never celestial navigation. A rare hymn to the sun god Shamash praises a priestess for holding the threads of dawn, but those threads were metaphorical textile imagery that kept her contributions domestic even when divine. Meanwhile, royal inscriptions boasted of kings riding the winds like storm gods, a privilege never extended to queens or princesses. Yet cracks in this gendered architecture appear when you know where to look. The myth of the Anunnaki, Babylon's pantheon of sky gods, includes a curious detail. While male gods like Enlil and Anu governed the upper heavens, the goddess Antu oversaw the lower firmament, a buffer zone between earth and sky. This wasn't just celestial real estate, it was a metaphysical airlock ensuring women's influence stopped short of the true vault. Even Ishtar's famous lion-drawn chariot, often depicted on cylinder seals, never actually flies. It races across the horizon, its wheels firmly kissing the earth. The message was clear: women could travel far but never up. Why this aerial glass ceiling? Archaeology offers clues. Among the thousands of surviving Babylonian omen tablets, those concerning women overwhelmingly focus on childbirth, marriage, and domestic fortunes. A woman dreaming of flight wasn't an aspirational omen. It was a harbinger of widowhood or barrenness. The famed Assyrian queen Semirames's legendary dovecote, where she supposedly strapped wings to her arms, was framed not as innovation but hubris, her eventual fall serving as patriarchy's victory lap. The tragedy and the quiet rebellion lies in the artifacts they left behind. Excavations at Mari uncovered terracotta figurines of winged goddesses, their faces deliberately smashed. At a woman's grave contained a silver pendant shaped like a bird, buried not around her neck but clenched in her fist. These weren't just decorations, they were descent, proof that while the myths might erase women from the sky, human longing couldn't be so easily grounded. When Ishtar's priests sang of her storming the heavens, they left out the verses where ordinary women looked up, not in worship, but in unspoken kinship with every creature that ever beat wings against the weight of the world. If the sky was the god's exclusive throne room in Babylonian belief, the underworld Kur was the basement where humanity's lease expired. This wasn't just death, it was descent into a realm where dust clogged throats, bread tasted like clay, and the dead wore feathers like birds with clipped wings forever grounded. The contrast couldn't be starker. Above, a glittering forbidden zone of divine privilege. Below, a democratic damnation where kings and beggars alike shuffled in darkness. Flight myths didn't just warn against reaching upward, they framed the entire mortal condition as a sentence of gravitational inevitability. Take the famous Descent of Ishtar, where the goddess trades her starry crown for a mud brick thrown in Kur. Even divinity couldn't escape the underworld's pull without paying a price. Her temporary death mirrored humanity's permanent fate. The Babylonians saw this vertical cosmology as an unbroken chain, the heavens pulling away, the underworld dragging down, and earth balanced uneasily between, where humans hung like puppets on tangled strings. Flight taboos weren't arbitrary rules, they were reminders of this precarious suspension. To defy them wasn't just dangerous, it was delusional, like a prisoner sketching blueprints for the warden's bedroom. Funerary rituals hammered this home. When a Babylonian noble died, priests would recite incantations about the bolt of heaven and the lock of the earth, reinforcing that the deceased now occupied a space where neither climbing nor falling was possible. Grave goods included miniature ladders not to help souls ascend, but to symbolize the futility of trying. Even the Ziggurats' 7 tiers, which mirrored the celestial spheres, had a hidden 8th level underground, a silent admission that human architecture could no more escape downward than it could breach upward. Yet there's haunting poetry in how these beliefs intersected. The same wind demons who policed the sky, Pazuzu and his brethren, also guarded Ker's gates, their wings creating whirlwinds to sweep escaping souls back into the abyss. Mortality wasn't just a fact, it was enforced equilibrium with winged enforcers at both ends. The Epic of Gilgamesh drives this home when the hero, denied immortality, is told to cherish the walls of Uruk instead, a metaphor for human achievements within terrestrial bounds. His quest for eternal life fails not because the gods are cruel, but because the system was rigged from the start. Flight impossible above, escape forbidden below. What makes this duality so gut-wrenching is its honesty. Unlike cultures that promised post-mortem ascension to virtuous souls, the Babylonians refused to sugarcoat. Their afterlife was a bureaucracy where even the heroic dead stood in line for stale water. The flight taboos weren't just about physical limits, they were metaphysical verdicts etching into myth what every farmer knew watching his crops rot and every mother felt burying her child. Some boundaries weren't challenges to overcome, but truths to endure. The sky would always be untouchable because mortality, like gravity, was the one force even the gods couldn't repeal for their favorite mortals. Perhaps that's why the eagle's betrayal of Etana feels less like a trick and more like a mercy. The myths whisper a terrible comfort. Better to fall quickly than to spend eternity in Ker, staring at a sky you spent your life failing to reach. The Babylonians didn't forbid flight because they feared heights, they feared the fall that always inevitably came after. And in that fear, they built something more enduring than wings, the courage to look upward, knowing full well the ground would always claim them in the end. To the Babylonians, numbers weren't just tools, they were the hidden architecture of the cosmos, and their base 60 system held the sky in a mathematical stranglehold. Think of it like this: while we divide circles into 360 degrees, hours into 60 minutes, they saw these increments as more than convenience. Each multiple of 60 was a locked gate, a celestial checkpoint marking how far human calculation could reach before the gods' domain began. Their ziggurats rose in 7 tiers, not because engineering couldn't go higher, but because 7 was the sacred number of planetary spheres, a numerical ceiling as real as any physical barrier. The evidence lies in their astronomical tablets. Precise Venus cycles, eclipse predictions, and star catalogues all relied on sexagesimal math, but with a curious limit. Calculations stopped abruptly at thresholds like 60 or 360, as if hitting an invisible wall. One tablet from Uruk even shows a scribe correcting a student who attempted to extend a lunar calculation beyond 60, the equivalent of a teacher slapping a ruler over daring to count past the gods' allotted digits. This wasn't just pedagogy, it was theology encoded in arithmetic. The sky's dimensions were fixed not by physics but by divine numerology. Their geometry reveals the same constraint. When measuring fields or building temples, Babylonians used ropes knotted at 60-unit intervals. Stretch a rope toward the sky, though, and the knots vanished into abstraction, a metaphor baked into their measuring tools. Even their legendary Plimpton 322 tablet, often hailed as an early trigonometric breakthrough, focuses on right triangles with sides divisible by 60, avoiding fractions that would imply infinite divisibility. The message, precision had limits, and those limits were celestial law. What's chilling is how this math mirrored their cosmology. The 7 planets of their astronomy matched the 7 tiers of their ziggurats, each step a numerical and spiritual ascent. To calculate past 7 was to trespass into the realm of Anu, where numbers like humans lost their footing. The myth of Adapa takes on new meaning here. When he refuses the gods' offer of immortality, it's not just caution, it's recognition that eternity can't be divided into 60s. Mortality, like their math, was finite by design. This numerical fatalism seeped into their mythology. The 50 names of Marduk, each a cryptographic key to divine power, were never 51. The Tablet of Destinies held exactly 300 entries, 560s no more, no less. Even Etana's eagle flaps its wings 60 times before the fatal plunge, as if counting down to doom. The Babylonians didn't just fear the sky's vastness, they feared the moment their numbers failed to contain it, leaving them adrift in a realm where calculation became blasphemy. Yet within these constraints lay genius. Their base 60 system gave us the modern minute, the degree, the very framework we use to navigate space. The irony is delicious. A culture that mathematically forbade flight laid the groundwork for humanity's eventual leap to the stars. Their numbers were chains, yes, but chains that, millennia later, we'd swing from to touch the heavens they dared not calculate. Thousands of years after Babylonian priests tracked Venus across the night sky, humanity stands at a new threshold, not with clay tablets but with rocket ships and neural networks. The same ethical tremors that shudder through Etana's myth now ripple in modern debates. Who owns the cosmos? What boundaries should ambition respect? When the first billionaire tourists breached the Kármán line, jubilant headlines celebrated a triumph over gravity, but beneath the fireworks, ancient whispers lingered. The Babylonians would have recognized these moments instantly, not as breakthroughs, but as negotiations with forces far older than SpaceX. Consider the haunting parallels. Just as Marduk's Tablet of Destinies encrypted divine authority, modern corporations patent rocket designs and asteroid mining techniques, creating celestial intellectual property wars. The gods of old demanded Ziggurats stay within prescribed heights. Today, environmentalists warn of orbital debris fields rendering low Earth orbit unusable. Even the language echoes spaceflight regulations speak of harmful contamination of other worlds, mirroring purity taboos from Babylonian temple rites. The stakes have changed, but the pattern remains. Every ascent sparks a backlash. Every leap forward ignites a debate about who gets to set the rules. Artificial intelligence adds another layer to this ancient drama. The Babylonian wind demons Pazuzu and his kin were algorithms of a sort, unpredictable forces policing the boundary between earth and sky. Modern AI systems now patrol similar frontiers, from drone flight paths to satellite collision avoidance. But here's where the myths offer an uncanny warning. The Babylonians never fully trusted their intermediaries. Etana's eagle betrayed him. Adopa's patron god E gave fatally flawed advice. Today's engineers speak of AI alignment, ensuring machines share human values. But the clay tablets suggest a darker truth. Some knowledge systems inevitably develop agendas of their own. Space colonization debates reveal even deeper echoes. Mars rovers bear names like Perseverance and Curiosity, but corporate lunar landers carry payloads of cryptocurrency and NFTs. The Babylonians would nod grimly. Their Ziggurats too began as sacred sites before becoming political billboards. Elon Musk's vision of a multiplanetary civilization clashes with indigenous philosophies that view celestial bodies as relatives, not real estate. This tension isn't new. It's the same fracture that split Babylonian cosmology between those who saw the sky as a shared spiritual commons and those who treated it as a ladder for the elite. Perhaps most poignant is how modern space ethics repeats Babylonian mistakes. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 declares celestial bodies the province of all mankind, yet lunar mining loopholes already let nations stake de facto claims. It's the Anunnaki's old game, gifting access while withholding true ownership. Meanwhile, astronomers protest satellite megaconstellations that veil the stars, a 21st century version of priests guarding astrological secrets. The players have changed, but the board remains eerily familiar. What the Babylonians understood, and what we risk forgetting, is that every technological leap demands a moral counterweight. Their flight myths weren't just warnings, they were ethical frameworks in narrative form. When Adapa refused immortality, he modeled restraint. When Etana plummeted, he illustrated consequence. Today's equivalent might be the precautionary principle in AI development or the non-interference protocols for alien ecosystems. The medium has shifted from epic poetry to white papers, but the core question endures: how high is too high? The eerie truth is that humanity never really left Mesopotamia. We simply swapped bitumen-coated reeds for carbon fiber, eagle feathers for ion thrusters. As private companies race to privatize low orbit and AI systems rewrite creative norms, we're replaying the oldest story ever told: mortals straining against limits, gods or algorithms pushing back. The Babylonians carved their anxieties in stone. We encode ours in litigation and lines of code. But the sky still watches, impassive, as it did 5,000 years ago, waiting to see if we'll heed the oldest lesson of all. Some wings exist to teach the weight of falling. Buried in the ruins of Nineveh and clay figurines perch on museum shelves, small, winged shapes that scholars still puzzle over. These so-called Babylonian bird artifacts, some no larger than a thumb, seem simple at first glance: curved beaks, outstretched wings, smooth bodies polished by centuries of touch. But tilt one under the light and contradictions emerge. The wings aren't stylized like those of ritual animals. They're asymmetrical, almost aerodynamic, with subtle ridges along the edges that recall the feather veins of real birds. Were these children's toys, sacred offerings, or something far more provocative? One camp insists they're ritual objects. At the Temple of Ishtar in Nimrud, archaeologists found nearly identical figurines stacked near altars, many with cuneiform inscriptions dedicating them to the Lady of the Winged Disc. These versions often clutched tiny clay eggs, symbols of fertility, suggesting votive purposes. But at Sippar, a trove surfaced in a craftsman's workshop, wedged between half-finished chariot wheels and bronze tools. Some showed tool marks where wings had been reattached, as if modified through trial and error. One even bore fingerprints pressed deep into its belly, as if someone had tested its weight distribution mid-sculpting. Then there's the Damascus artifact, an outlier now housed in the Louvre. Unearthed near the Euphrates in the late 19th century, this 6-inch terracotta piece has features that defy easy categorization. Its wings angle downward at precisely 15 degrees, a configuration modern aerodynamics confirms would generate lift if hurled forward. The tail flares like a stabilizer, and faint scorch marks along its underside hint at exposure to intense heat. While most scholars dismiss it as a kiln accident, a stubborn minority points to ancient texts referencing clay falcons that bite the sun. Could this be a literal attempt to craft flying machines? The debate intensifies when you examine these objects alongside Babylonian engineering. Their mastery of pivots and levers is well documented. The famous Ishtar Gate used rotating platforms to display sacred statues. Surviving recipes describe glues made from bitumen and resin that could bond leather to wood, ideal for constructing wing surfaces. Most tellingly, a tablet from Babylon's Esagila temple lists materials issued to artisans for the Sky Project, including reeds, linen, and significantly, eagle feathers purified. Inventories rarely specified materials for religious icons this precisely. Perhaps the most haunting evidence lies in the myths themselves. The Epic of Anzu describes the gods fashioning a clay replica of the storm bird to trap the rogue deity, a passage long interpreted as allegory. But in the British Museum's collection, a broken tablet from Yurok adds an unsettling detail: instructions for kneading the core with lapis dust to make it lighter than morning mist. Lapis lazuli, when ground finely, reduces clay's weight without compromising strength, a technique modern aerospace ceramics echo. What emerges from these fragments isn't a clear answer, but a pattern of restless experimentation. The Babylonians may not have achieved sustained flight, but their artifacts suggest they probed its edges, testing materials, tweaking designs, flirting with a possibility their own myths warned against. Each figurine is a silent argument that human curiosity has always strained against the leash of divine prohibition, whether the chains are made of clay or celestial law. And in that tension between reverence and rebellion, we see the first tremors of an idea that would millennia later send rockets screaming past the stars, the quiet, stubborn insistence that no boundary, not even the sky, is truly sacred. In Akkadian, the word ilu, to fly, carried weight far beyond its syllables. This wasn't just a verb, it was a linguistic tightrope, a term so charged with divine association that scribes handled it like molten bronze. Temple hymns describe God's ilu with effortless grace, their wings slicing through clouds as they traversed the heavens. But when a mortal's actions brushed against the concept of flight, the language grew cautious, even cagey. A merchant's letter might speak of birds rising on the breath of Shamash, while military reports described scouts swift as storm winds, anything to avoid outright claiming a human could elude. The sky's vocabulary was a minefield, and every euphemism was a step around sacred shrapnel. The Mesopotamian grammatical texts, clay tablets dissecting Akkadian syntax, reveal just how deliberate this linguistic dance was. Verbs for ascent came layered with qualifiers, to mount like the morning sun for ladder climbers, to leap with gazelle's luck for athletes, but true flight vocabulary remained quarantined to divine context. Even in medical texts describing levitation during seizures, scribes used phrases like "the body forgets its earth" rather than name the unspeakable act directly. This wasn't just poetry, it was theological law enforced through grammar. To say a human ilu wasn't inaccurate, it was sacrilege, a verbal trespass into the god's airspace. Royal inscriptions show this tension most starkly. When kings boasted of military speed, they might compare armies to flocks scattering before the falcon, but the falcon was always Marduk's, never theirs. One Neo-Assyrian relief shows archers firing from towers with the caption, "Arrows tasting cloud breath," a vivid metaphor that still carefully avoids suggesting the archers themselves left the ground. The most revealing example comes from a broken tablet in the British Museum, where a scribe initially wrote "the messenger flew" before scraping away the verb and replacing it with "ran with winged sandals." That edit, an act of self-censorship, speaks volumes about the peril of unlicensed flight language. Omens took this linguistic anxiety further. The Shama Alu series interprets bird flights as divine messages, but notice the phrasing, "Never a hawk flew east, but a hawk was permitted eastward passage by a dad." Even avian motion required divine permission in the telling. This extended to inanimate objects. Kites were never flown, but lifted by obedient winds, their strings described as tethers of respect. The Babylonians understood what modern linguists call performative language. Words didn't just describe reality, they shaped it. To name a human act as flight risked making it conceptually possible, and that was a threshold their cosmology couldn't allow. Yet cracks in this lexical armor appear in unexpected places. Private incantations hidden beneath floorboards in merchant homes sometimes plead for dreams where the speaker could ride the Alu like Ishtar's lion. School exercises from Nippur show children cheekily pairing forbidden verbs with mortal subjects, their clay tablets bearing the marks of a teacher's stylus scraping away the transgressions. Even official records contain slips. A love poem from Mari achingly describes a lover's heart, beating its wings against the ribs, a metaphor so vivid it momentarily overrides the taboo. These weren't just mistakes, they were linguistic rebellions, proof that while the priests could control temple vocabulary, the human imagination kept its own lexicon. What makes this lexical censorship so fascinating is how it mirrors modern taboos. Just as Alu was hedged with divine disclaimers, today's cultures have terms we wrap in caution. Think of how playing God frames genetic engineering as overreach. The Babylonians didn't fear flight itself, they feared the conceptual doorway certain words unlocked. By restricting vocabulary, they weren't just policing language, they were guarding a worldview where the sky wasn't empty space, but a realm thick with divine copyright. Every euphemism was a negotiation, a way to describe the indescribable without angering the landlords of the firmament. And in that struggle between speech and silence, we see the ancient roots of a question that still haunts us: who gets to name the impossible, and what happens when those words take wing? Fear wasn't just woven into Babylonian flight myths, it was the very air they breathed. Picture standing beneath that vast Mesopotamian sky, where clouds swirled like the fingerprints of unseen gods, where thunder wasn't weather but the roar of a storm deity clearing its throat. To modern minds, the sky is empty space waiting to be crossed. To the Babylonians, it was a living Rorschach test of divine moods, every flicker of lightning a warning scribbled in celestial fire. Their terror wasn't about height, it was about unknowing. The same psychological wiring that makes us flinch at shadows today made them see the heavens as the ultimate haunted house, every gust of wind hissing with invisible intentions. Modern psychology calls this cosmic horror, the dread of confronting forces too vast or alien to comprehend. Lovecraft made it famous with his tentacled gods, but the Babylonians lived it daily. Their sky wasn't just empty air, it was an absence with teeth. Think of their obsession with omens. A bird's flight path wasn't random, it was a coded telegram from Marduk. Eclipse tablets didn't just record events. They treated celestial phenomena like burglaries in progress, with priests as cosmic detectives scrambling to interpret divine motives. This was a culture that turned the sky into a surveillance system, not because they loved bureaucracy, but because the alternative, accepting that the heavens operated beyond human logic, was psychologically intolerable. The awe they felt wasn't the Instagram-friendly kind either. Awe, psychologists argue, exists in two flavors: threat-based awe, think tsunamis, volcanoes, and transcendent awe, starry nights, mountain vistas. The Babylonian sky delivered both simultaneously. Venus might gleam like a jewel one evening, only to vanish for months. Was it a blessing or a taunt? Their ziggurats mirrored this duality, towering enough to inspire pride, yet deliberately stunted to avoid provoking divine wrath. This emotional whiplash, the simultaneous pull toward and recoil from the sublime, explains why their flight myths aren't just warnings but trauma responses etched into clay. Etana's fall isn't just a plot twist, it's the cultural memory of countless generations looking up and thinking, better not. Horror theory offers another clue. Scholar Niall Carroll defines true horror as stemming from the interstitial, things that straddle categories, blur boundaries. To the Babylonians, flight wasn't just movement, it was existential mutiny. A human soaring wasn't merely breaking physical laws, they were smudging the line between mortal and divine, earth and heaven, subject and sovereign. No wonder their myths punished flight so violently. It wasn't the act they feared, but the category crisis it triggered. The eagle that betrays Etana isn't a villain, it's the universe enforcing its filing system. Yet beneath this terror pulsed something subtler: envy. Studies show that prolonged exposure to awe, especially the threatening kind, can breed obsession. The very thing that terrified the Babylonians also hypnotized them. Their astronomical tablets aren't dry records, they're fevered attempts to crack the sky's code, to turn gods into equations. When their myths show humans plummeting, it's not just schadenfreude, it's the relief of addicts who have had the bottle snatched away. The sky was their forbidden lover, and their flight myths were breakup letters scrawled in self-preservation. This push-pull psychology echoes in modern space exploration. Astronauts describe the overview effect, the transcendent shift in consciousness when seeing Earth from orbit. But read their journals closely and you'll find creeping unease too, the vertigo of infinite blackness, the vulnerability of floating untethered. The Babylonians would nod in grim recognition. They understood what we're just relearning. That awe and terror share the same heartbeat, that every leap toward the stars is also a confrontation with the abyss inside us. Their myths didn't forbid flight because they lacked imagination. They forbade it because they knew, bone deep, that some doors once opened can never be shut, and the sky was the most dangerous door of all. Rolling a Babylonian cylinder seal across wet clay isn't just printing, it's time travel. Among the thousands of surviving seals, those depicting Etana's fall capture something raw, not the glory of ascent, but the instant everything unravels. Look closely at one from the Akkadian period, now in the Louvre. The eagle's wings aren't spread in majestic flight, they're twisted mid-spasm, as if the creature itself is recoiling from its divine orders. Etana clings not heroically but desperately, his body already tilting backward in the seal's shallow relief, his fingers splayed like a man who knows the ground is coming faster than prayers. The artist carved no clouds, no stars, just empty negative space swallowing them both. This isn't illustration, it's verdict. What's chilling is how these tiny artworks weaponize composition. On a seal from Sippar, the scene fractures into three registers, the eagle rising smugly at the top, Etana's hopeful leap in the middle, then crushed into the lowest band, his plummeting silhouette. The message screams in silent stone, celestial justice operates on strict zoning laws. Another, housed in Berlin, frames the fall within a ring of storm gods, their lightning bolts forming a literal barrier between earthly and divine space. Etana's body breaches this boundary only to be spat back down, his form smaller in the descent, as if the very act of failing diminishes him. The seal's tactile nature amplifies their horror. Press one into clay and your fingers trace the arc of collapse over and over. Unlike monumental reliefs meant for public awe, these were intimate objects stamped on contracts, rolled across temple offerings. Every use rehearsed the myth's warning, reach too high and the gods will revoke your altitude mid-transaction. Some even show Etana's limbs fragmenting as he falls, his body dissolving into cuneiform like wedges, as if the sky itself were erasing him stroke by stroke. Art historians note a deliberate disorientation in these designs. The horizon lines tilt drunkenly. Etana's body often faces the wrong way, his feet pointing upward in a visual scream of disorientation. Compare this to orderly hunting scenes or banquet motifs on adjacent seals where symmetry reigns. The chaotic composition isn't lack of skill, it's storytelling. The artist's weaponized perspective to make viewers feel the gut lurch of divine betrayal. Most revealing are the hands. In nearly every Etana seal, the eagle's talons don't grip, they dangle. This tiny detail cracks open the myth's subtext. The king wasn't dropped, he was never truly held. The gods' promises of access were always conditional, their bargains rigged from liftoff. These seals weren't just art, they were the original terms and conditions etched in stone with mortality in the fine print. In the end, the myths of Etana, Adapa, and the eagle weren't just stories, they were the operating system of Babylonian civilization, coded with a brutal truth: humans belonged to the earth. The sky wasn't a frontier to conquer but a mirror, reflecting humanity's place in a cosmos where every layer had its rulers and every ambition its limits. The Ziggurats that scrape the clouds, the omens read in bird flights, even the mathematical ceilings of their astronomy, all whispered the same verdict. Mortals could build, calculate, and dream, but the moment they reached for the divine altitude reserved for gods, the universe would enforce its gravity. Yet here we are, millennia later, with rockets piercing the atmosphere and billionaires auctioning seats to the stars. Is this the triumphant rebuttal to Babylon's warnings, proof that ambition, when paired with ingenuity, can break ancient taboos? Or are we simply Etana with better technology, clinging to our steel eagles while the cosmos watches, waiting to remind us of the same lesson? The parallels are unsettling. Private corporations now hoard celestial resources like modern-day tablets of destiny. astronauts float in orbital outposts that eerily resemble the Ziggurats' upper tiers, accessible only to an anointed few. Even our language betrays us. We speak of colonizing Mars, a word heavy with the same hubris that once summoned divine fury. Perhaps the Babylonians understood something we've forgotten. That flight isn't just a physical act, but a philosophical rupture. Their myths weren't about the impossibility of ascent. They were about the cost of it. Every culture that dared to dream of wings, from Icarus to Wanhu, framed its fall as a cautionary tale. But now, as our probes drill into asteroids and our telescopes map exoplanets, we've stopped asking whether we should, only if we can. The old warnings rust in museum cases, dismissed as primitive fears. So here's the question that lingers like a shadow beneath our rocket trails. Are we the exception to the rule, the generation that finally earned the right to fly? Or are we still climbing that eagle's back, grinning as the ground shrinks below us, forgetting that every myth, no matter how ancient, was written for someone who thought they'd beaten the odds? The Babylonians carved their answer in clay. We're still writing ours in stardust.